Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading property experts as they share with you the insider's guide to property investing.
All right, folks, you're on the Property Couch, your insider's guide to property investing. I'm Bryce, Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle channel. And he's Ben Kingsley, chair of the Property Investment Professionals of Australia and also the current Property Investment Advisor of the Year, mate. How are you?
I'm super.
You're super?
Absolutely super.
Oh, mate, that's good.
Just up and about. Life is good, you know, weather's good, place is good, property market's active.
Is that because the cricket season's coming?
Oh, yeah, I can't think about anything else. I had to get more work done in the off-season of the footy. I've got an idea.
Yeah.
They should play the young kids, the draft potential kids, through summer. I mean, Etihad's an air-conditioned venue, so why wouldn't you, some of those kids obviously play cricket as well, but let's face it, I'd be more interested in doing that than watching cricket.
Really?
Pretty simple.
No concerns that they'd sort of overheat in the
No, it's air-conditioned.
Mate.
Etihad's air-conditioned. So you only play them indoors and keep the boys, cool. We don't want to cook them. Don't want to cook them before we start. But yeah, there's got to be something we can do.
So Etihad Stadium can cater on a 42-degree day for being temperature controlled at 19 degrees.
Look, you still play in spring, mate. You're still playing footy in 26, 27 degrees. I mean, in the grand final's 28 degrees or something. Oh, yeah. So here's an idea: reaching out to the AFL.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm sure they're listening to the podcast.
Do all that stuff in summer. Do all of that stuff. The kids are outside of school commitments, so they can focus on their footy. And I'd get down and have a look. I want to see all the future stars coming through.
But in the absence of that, it means I can reach out to you on a Friday night because I know you won't be watching a one-dayer. So
Pretty much.
Okay.
I've got an idea of what we need to do to inject cricket. 2020. I was on to 2020 10 years before they even invented it.
Yeah, right. This is good.
And have a listen to this, listeners. This is what we need to do to 2020 cricket. Right? If a batsman goes out there and blocks a ball or pushes it for a single, we can SMS him out. So in other words, they must. So you're talking about how you make the game survive. You need interaction with the audience, and the audience is going to sit there and basically, now you can't be SMS'd out before you face a ball because there'll be a few players that'll be really happy about that happening. But that's my idea. So basically, if the crowd doesn't like the way you're batting and you're pushing for singles and carrying on, then we can SMS you out. And when the majority, think of the revenue.
I was going to say, I'm thinking, can we
I'm telling you,
via the property couch?
Listen to that. Have a listen to all those sports producers. If the audience, it's a bit like the live die back in the old Coliseum days. Yeah, so let him live, let him die. Well, same thing, live die SMS. Obviously, they're not physically dying, but there you go.
So what percent, have you thought this through? I mean, 80% of the audience, 50% of the audience.
No, it's got to be over 50. It's got to be over 50. 50% are saying this bloke's boring. And because they're coming there to see, them swing like a dunny door, and I'd go and watch that. Whereas, if I could have some interaction, but no.
I'm a bit suspicious. You know a fair bit about cricket for someone who doesn't like cricket.
I still played plenty of cricket as a kid, street cricket, backyard cricket, all that type of thing. And I've got a lot of mates who are passionate about cricket. All right, so your
credibility is slowly coming back, which is good.
Yeah, I can still check the scores, but I just can't sit there and watch cricket like some can.
Well, I think the fact he doesn't like cricket and he's a Collingwood supporter says it all. But
don't get advice from me on property.
Well, you said it. I was just thinking it. Here we go.
Rightio.
Q&A.
Another Q&A. Beautiful.
Q&A.
Love the Q&A days.
Now, Tim has written into us. Now, Tim, I'm going to get this surname wrong, but it's Nugent. I think it's Nugent.
Yep. That's how you.
We haven't had a great success rate with. In fact, I think there was an Eastern European name we did. Kowalski or something, and he wrote in and let Ivis know that we were nowhere near it.
Sorry about that.
So that's fair to say we're probably nowhere near this. Hi, Property Couch team. Really enjoyed all the podcasts you've shared. Thanks for sharing your wealth of knowledge. I just have a question. I hope you can answer. For a person that's looking to purchase an investment property where they've already educated themselves on investment from podcasts, I know of a few good ones.
Yep.
Read property investment books and attended seminars, and they've done all their due diligence from getting the right loan structure, finding the right location with all the growth drivers, will there be any benefits to engage a buyer's agent? Thanks in advance for your answer. Greatly appreciate. Regards, Tim. Keep up the good work. I think if I answer this, it's probably agenda driven. So maybe I'm a buyer's agent.
Yeah, well, but I'm a buyer's agent too, but you just do it more often than I do. Look, I think there is, but it comes down to the quality of the BA. I mean, the honest thing there is there's plenty of BAs out there who aren't worth their coin that you pay them. So you'd want, using your terminology, an investment savvy BA, and what sort of research do they bring to the table? I mean, if you've picked your area and you are about to buy and you've done all your research, there's going to be some blind spots to the BA, and I'll get you to go onto those. But I'm of the view that even with the best amount of reading, if you're only doing it part-time and they're doing it full-time, and they have an unbelievable amount of information, and they're a borderless BA, in other words, they will hunt and gather across the nation, then I think there's value in a BA. If they're just working in one little local area and they know their patch and they can potentially get you an off-market if you think that's a good area, then there's another value. But there's not too many other things that I would say jump out at me.
Tim, I think you sound very confident with what you're doing, so that's to be commended. I always say a BA will help you do one of three things better. Pick the right asset, make sure you don't pay too much, and make sure you don't procrastinate. So they're three immediate things that spring to mind. But I'm going to put an offer in this afternoon on a property where there was 28 groups through on Saturday, 5 offers have come in, 2 more this morning, and mine will make it the 8th. Now, the relationship I have with this agent is that I've bought numerous properties from him, so I've got the insider word. Now, to be honest, every real estate agent that you talk to will say that's unethical, we never do that, but I can assure you, without sort of throwing any agents under the bus, they've only got their time to sell, and they're going to go for what I call minimum effective dose, line of least resistance. How am I going to get a good outcome for my vendor whilst making it easy on my time and my energy and effort? So I would say that a buyer's agent can deliver you economies of scale, they can deliver you the network, they can make sure that you don't procrastinate. Because if you're up against me on that particular property, Tim, for example, you're in the market again next weekend and the weekend after, whereas I've already moved on to another one. So even if you are good at picking assets, even if you think that you won't pay too much, even if you think that you won't procrastinate, the relationships is something that you can't emulate unless you are doing it yourself. But look, at the end of the day, this podcast is about helping people equip themselves to be better investors, make better decisions, know how to pick better assets. So I'm all for our listener base being able to get out there and do it themselves. But my job as a buyer's agent is to demonstrate value and then deliver on that. And I'm pretty confident that we can do that. But
I don't disagree. And I think Bryce nailed it there in a couple of senses that when we go and see a selling agent and we introduce ourselves as a buying agent, the first thing that they know is we're a licensed real estate agent, just like they are. Secondly, I make it my point that I introduce our company and I say we buy up to 200 properties a year. Now, a savvy selling agent is going to think, that's interesting. If I have a good relationship with this buying agent, we could potentially put quite a few deals together, and that's going to be important for me in terms of my own remuneration, as well as obviously getting the right outcome for the seller. So it's really important to understand that. Now, episode 18, we did talk about what is a buyer's agent and why use one. So check out that episode if you're new to the podcast. There's a whole podcast dedicated to that. So, and then negotiation skills. I think you nailed it, mate. In terms of, there's no doubt that if you've negotiated on literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of properties, that your negotiation skills are going to be superior from someone who's trying to do it. Just no different than a great poker player. They'll always beat you in the first few years because they have the experience and the skill of knowing what cards to play and when to play them, and that's what you're buying. So it's a really good point.
If you're buying at auction, there's nothing that you can simulate that public speaking environment until you get there. And it's amazing when you've got ice running through your veins, your heart's beating out of your chest, and you can forget some of the work that you've done in advance. So I would say auctions. I have a strategy where I know that I can beat 9 out of 10 people at auction in terms of knowing how to put the spotlight onto them. And I can, I recently bought one for someone's principal place of residence for 1.816. They gave me 1.88 to buy it. So we saved them $65,000 just because we knew the body language. Mm-hmm. And I'll say off markets, and I'm going to say this very respectfully, because I get really annoyed when buyer's agents sign up a client by saying, come and deal with me because I'm going to get you an off-market. Because to be honest, off-markets are just basically a reflection of the strength of the relationships that you have in the marketplace with your real estate agents. So some people get them, some people don't, and it really depends on if the buyer's agent's going to be adversarial versus they're going to be accommodative in terms of their dealing. Of course, getting the best outcome for the client, but off-markets would be something that I would say is a huge advantage from using a buyer's agent. But I just want to say, beware of the buyer's agent who says they get off markets, but they don't actually have access to them.
Yeah, and look, the other point from an off market is a lot of buyer's agents refer to off markets when technically they're not off markets, they're just pre-markets.
Advanced listings.
Yeah, advanced listings. So be careful of those who are spruiking their services to you by saying, oh, I get off markets. Well, in some cases, these advanced listings, these pre-markets, they're just getting first chance to go through the door. But don't make any mistake. If there's 5 or 6 buyers agents that have a relationship with that selling agent, they're all going to get to go through it. So whereas you may not, as a public buyer, get that opportunity. And if they meet the vendor's expectations quickly, then you as a buyer, as a public buyer, Tim, won't have a chance to have a shot at that particular good property.
Tim, if I was buying a new principal place of residence, I'd get Ben or Veronica to do it for me because that layer of emotion doesn't need to be there, and my wife would be scratching my arms out in she would be giving too much body language off to the other buyers, so I'd want to make sure she's as far away from the action as possible. But so in personally, I'd buy my own investments at auction, no problem, but if it was my own principal place of residence and I was changing hands, I'd get Ben or Veronica to do that for me. Hopefully that helps, Tim. And if you could maybe send us a little note just to let us know what you actually bought, we'd be happy to critique that for you. And if you were keen to let the listener base have a little look at that under the bonnet as well, I'm sure everyone can get some benefits. So thanks for a great question.
Okay, next question is a finance-related question. It comes in from Jonathan Davies. Thanks for your question, Jonathan. Due to interest rates having been low for a few years now and flexibility in terms of loans are good, when is it best to fix them? When interest rate reaches, say, a point of 6 or 7%, is that the time to go? Do you refinance your home loan or do you do a 50-50 fixed and variable? What is a good rule of thumb on this topic? He also goes on to say, cheers, I listen to the podcast every day. I download onto my phone and review them as I'm a FIFO, fly in, fly out. So one of our miners in and out of town. So keep up the good work. So thanks for your question. Bryce, what do you reckon?
Yeah, good one. I've got a client who's FIFO as well, does a little bit of the same. So look, I think, it's largely Ben's area, so I'd probably just throw a few top line bullet points for him to expand on. But ultimately, with interest rates being so low, it's questionable, how much further they will go lower. So if you want some certainty around cash flow, it doesn't make for a bad idea to fix a portion of it. But ultimately, saying to the listeners, this is not advice. You need to seek independent advice. It's just some general concepts here. But ultimately, if you need to think about if you're going to fix it for 5 years, for example, you need to work out how much surplus cash flow you're generating each year and put that in place for the next 5 years, plus a little premium buffer if you get a bonus or a commission that comes on top of that. Because ultimately, you want to be putting your because you can't put an offset account against the fixed component of the loan, it's only against the variable component. So if you're wanting to top up, if you have the strategy of topping up your offset account, you want to be putting that against the variable amount. You want to make sure that you don't run out of variable component before the fixed term runs out, because it'll cost you a fair bit of money.
You're right, mate. And look, I'd just add to that. There's usually the standard rule of fixed loans are these. You fix a loan if you want peace of mind. Okay, so that's a nice little general rule of thumb for the average mum and dad who are setting up their mortgage at the moment. For property investors who are building out a strategy, then cash flow is king. So at the moment, for all the property plans that we're building for our clients, we are making some recommendations on 3 and 5 year fixed loans, not predominantly all of the loan. We're using, again, that good rule of thumb is how much surplus income before we buy the next property. So we don't want to ever be in a position where we've got too much money on top of our offset balance that we can't put anywhere on the loan. So it's important to work those numbers out and then work on that. So a 50-50 isn't a bad rule of thumb in terms of doing that. The other thing I would also say is, you mentioned about loan flexibility. You're absolutely right, is that if you are going to lock into a lender for 3 to 5 years, there are break costs, and some of those break costs can be significant. So it's important to think that if I'm going to go with lender A and then they change their servicing calculators, or credit comes in, they have a few bad debts and they tighten up on a few things, that's potentially the risk that you have in doing that fixed loan. So we normally, if we're going to do something like that, we'll stay with the majors. If we're with a second tier or third tier lender, sometimes it's best not to fix because they are a little bit more erratic in their behaviour and a little bit more unpredictable. And when they are unpredictable, there can be challenges in terms of resetting or getting out or releasing further equity and so forth. So,
because that was a conversation we had with our mortgage team last week, wasn't it?
Yeah.
In terms of maybe on paper, technically it makes sense to fix for a longer period of time, but in a changing lending environment now where we don't quite know what's around the corner, you might want to just keep that in mind. It may financially make sense to go a bit longer, but in terms of getting a bit more convenience, you might want to do it a bit shorter.
So it is going to be a horses for courses, a case-by-case assessment. But yes, loans are historically low. Will they stay lower for longer? Potentially they may, but it's just important for you to understand that. So I'd want to have a look at your cash flows, do some analysis on that, and then, like any decent licensed mortgage broker, I'd make the recommendations that are appropriate for you.
Thanks for your question, Jonathan.
Yeah, ripper.
Okay, Hanny. Discussion, very short and simple from Hanny, knows exactly what he or she wants. Discussion of the pros and cons of investing in commercial property.
Commercial property, that little chestnut. Okay, so I remember when I was on my learning journey around property knowledge and property investment knowledge, I was a...
Geez, you got a good memory.
I wanted a thirst a long time ago. I wanted a thirst for what's going on in terms of all market opportunities. And I remember going and listening to a gentleman by the name of Scott Keck. Scott is been around in the valuation industry in Melbourne for many, many, many years. He'll tell you how many. And he
Charter Keck
Kramer, one of the largest valuation firms in Melbourne, speaks to a lot of high-profile people. And I remember him saying that until you build up a $5 million residential property portfolio, I wouldn't necessarily be chasing any commercial. And now that, I reckon that presentation was back in around 2004, and I caught up with him recently and heard him speak at a recent gig, and he'd changed that to 10 million.
Oh.
So he'd done and I went up and spoke to him afterward and I said, Scott, I heard you say that, in 2004. And that's the sort of benefit that he saw in residential property. So let's unpack it. Commercial property is either commercial, industrial type property. So you've got retail, you've got commercial, you've got industrial. So all of those things. Now, what's an attractive thing for commercial property is traditionally the tenant pays everything. So they pay for the upkeep, the maintenance, the fit out, and you just take the rent roll. And traditionally it's been a higher yielding asset than what it is for residential property. The difference, however, is that residential property is an essential need. It is shelter, whereas a lot of businesses don't necessarily have to go into commercial properties. In fact, the building that we've recently just fitted out sat vacant for 5 years. So if you had this property and you're fairly wealthy, you don't care, but if that cash flow was critical to continuing to build out your strategy, you could have an asset that's vacant where you're getting no income from it. Now, it would be impossible to have a residential property that was vacant for 5 years unless it was inhabitable. So the message there is you'll get more reliability and you'll usually get more value growth out of your residential property unless you're playing in the big boys end of town, greater than 10 million in terms of site value.
That's right, higher risk, higher reward. I don't know if our listeners are familiar with a company called Kogan. It's an online retail store. And Jerry Harvey, at the time that Kogan came into the market, made a huge sort of publicity announcement around that where he thought it was not a level playing field, and history's gone on to show that Kogan's become a very successful brand. And essentially they are an online retailer. They don't have any bricks and mortar sort of shop fronts, and therefore their cost base is quite low, and all they need to do is have shipping and places where they store their product and send it out. That's, to me, one of the biggest threats towards commercial property for people like you say who are not in that $5 to $10 million space, because they could be very, very vulnerable. And I always say residential real estate is the only investment market in the world not dominated by investors, and yet commercial is dominated by sophisticated investors. And
sorry, Bryce, you go.
I just think it's not to be entered into lightly.
Yeah, and that's a perfect retail example. I mean, Bridge Road in Richmond, we saw retail values slow down. Oxford Street, Paddington, again, were really great shopping strips for some of the latest fashion items and so forth. They'd really struggled. And if we go into industrial, what you normally find with industrial is you get a factory that's modern today, and you get your 10-year tenant, 5 by 5, but then all of a sudden they're then looking for the more modern factory with the basically the better lift facilities in terms of lifting weights of machinery and that around, and so the building becomes obsolete. And so to actually then get the same tenant in or a better tenant in, you've got to spend a lot in terms of your internal structures and your infrastructure in the building. And so that's also a danger. Now, we come from a bias to residential property, so let's disclose that out there. It's very rare that we get people into commercial properties. We've done maybe one or two on my journey, but the majority of our clients will stick with residential because of that flight to safety, I suspect.
I think that's the key, the flight to safety. So for clarity, we're not anti-commercial property.
No.
We just think that higher return comes from higher risk, and for us to advise clients, we prefer to go the lower risk option.
And if you are looking for a safer commercial opportunity, real estate investment trusts, now it's not recommendation, but it's just go and get some general information about them. You've got the big end of town, which is the likes of Westfield, you've got GPT, you've got Lend Lease, and then you've also potentially got some smaller ones that sit outside of the stock market. So there may be an opportunity to invest in those, but again, go and speak to a licensed financial planner to get some information on those.
Thank you, Hanny. Hope that helped with you on that question. Josh Hogan sent one in. Hi guys, I think the show is exceptionally informative and well presented. My question is around Bryce's publications and the extent yield and growth percentages are applied. Exploring these publications, I have found that the sum of both the yield and the growth figures never exceed 12 to 13%. Just for clarity for the listeners, they're Money Magazine articles that we get to write the cover story for. Is this a rule of thumb? If so, to what extent can you divide these figures up when building an investment plan? Is this constrained by property value? What is considered average? What is considered exceptional? And using a BA, what can be expected? Well, mate, you're the property investment advisor here. This is right up your alley.
Josh, I love this question. Because I suppose it gives me the ability to give some insights into this. And this is what our book's about. Because with the book, we're going to be giving 6 case studies and showing that. Now, so the reality is this, Josh, is when you are advising from a professional qualified position, you need to be realistic about what can take shape over a long period of time. So if you're doing financial modelling and forecasting, you want to basically to make sure that those projections are relatively reliable. Now, we all know that we can read quarterly results on certain suburbs and they may have gone up 25, 30 or 40%. And you all know my views on some of those quarterly numbers. I think they're not statistically reliable. So over the longer term is how we track things. So just to give you an idea, we've tracked Melbourne median house prices by suburb since 1974, and we know that median return has been around 8% compounding. Now that's the value return, and if we then look at the long-term yield returns, we're sort of seeing them sit around 4 to 5%. So add those two numbers together, there's your 12 to 13. So now, in saying that, we've been more and more cautious, and this is my big warning to all people who are looking to get into property investing, that the rising tide that's lifted all ships in the past around interest rates, income and so forth is going to slow. So asset selection, location selection is going to be more important than ever in terms of getting into this marketplace. So to finish off my 2 bobs worth, I'd also then like to say that, so when you look to do a strategy, you look at the area locations and then you look at the property. So some area locations give a better yield story than growth, some give a better growth story than yield, and that's what we go into lots of detail. And I think in a future podcast, we will talk about those 18 different strategies that we've got available because I think it's going to be good listening.
So, and to add to what Ben said, it's all about having an underlying principle of being conservative, because if we go way back to the beginning of the podcast, we talked about the fact that 73% of all property investors stop at 1. So there's no point being uber aggressive in these figures. So you could probably tell from Ben's discussion then that he's the number one guy I go to when I've got a query. Whenever I get to build a strategy, I go to him first. So you can see that part of his philosophy has become my philosophy over the time that we've known each other. So we build plans together, so we're united in our views on that conservative approach.
I'll tell you what I'll do for the listeners. I'll actually just model a couple of examples. So I'll do a little video model where I do 4% yield and basically a 6% growth story.
Yep.
And then I'll do it the other way around and show over the longer period of time exactly what that looks like. Now, it's going to take me a couple of weeks.
I was going to say that's where people have to get onto our social media, because you'll find out from social media when Ben does that. So Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, that's where you'll find out what Ben just talked about then. So feel free to get on the Property Couch, because our producer Ivis just went into overload then. She was panicking.
Well, I think it's really important because they do tell a different story. So even though there's 12 or 13%, if you had a 10% compounding growth return and only a 2% yield, the value is going to be in the millions and millions, but you're not going to get the big income, but you're still creating wealth for yourself. Whereas the other way around, it's going to look like, wow, I'm getting this huge cash flow, but the value of the asset's not growing. So there is very much, even though it's around that 12, 13%, in most cases, Josh, you'll find most of my plans that I deliver for clients on a week in, week out basis are actually now around 11 to 12, because I'm just conscious of the compounding nature of wealth creation and trying to get that property story right, because I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. We want to be in a position where we underpromise and hopefully, overdeliver for those people to have a stress-free, self-funding retirement.
Agreed, Ben. I think if our listeners are keen to get some, you've actually done a case study where you and I spoke to the certified practicing accountants down in Lawn, and you built a case study. So if they can indulge us, because that video is actually what we use within our business here.
Correct.
So we're happy to put that up on thepropertycouch.com.au.
Yep.
It'll have Empower Wealth branding on it. So if you can forgive us for that, we're not certainly trying to plug Empower here, but that video has got some cracking content where we talk about the frameworks, but then Ben goes and shows how he builds a portfolio live.
And that's had, 20-odd thousand?
I think it's up to 40,000 now.
40,000 views. There you go. So obviously, and look, that's talking to other trade professionals.
Yeah.
So, trying to teach accountants to give property advice is always good rather than tax advice.
Agreed. So that'll show you what Ben does for a living and shows you how he does it. So we'll put that up and so you can have a bit of a listen and a look through. Beautiful. Josh, great question. I think that...
look at the time. Time flies when you're having fun.
It does fly when we're having fun. So a couple of things come out of that, Ben. There's one, we very much appreciate the effort that people go to send us in some queries. So we love answering them. Again, reiterating the fact that there's no advice here. It's just general concepts that you can go and check with your trusted advisors. And again, if you want to see those videos or find out first when we send those videos, please go to our social media and tune in to those, Ivis, as you look at me thinking, can I get these words out of my mouth? And Ben, the other thing we can do for our loyal listeners is we can give them an advanced look at our book, The Armchair's Guide to Property Investing, How to Retire on $2,000 per week, and a very special discount to them. So if they go to thepropertycouch.com.au/book and put in the special code TPC, as in the Property Couch, and as soon as they put the TPC in there, they will get that very special discount. And there's one last thing.
What's that?
Reviews.
That
helps us get our podcast up to the top of the charts. So if someone, I know that most people probably listen to their podcast on a device and they're not sitting in front of a computer screen, so it's not easy to do a review. But if you're loving what you're hearing and you're keen to help us out, that would be uber helpful to go and leave us a review either on iTunes or leave it on our website, and we can make sure that gets out to a few folks. Any closing comments from you, Ben, on a big Q&A day?
Oh, no, just again, it's just a delight to be able to answer these questions and make it real for you as the listener. There's a lot of information here. It could be information overload. So, if you want a specific scenario talked about and discussed, and we can do that for you, then shoot us a question.
We guarantee we will get to your question. It might not be sort of the week after you send it, but we will definitely get to your question. So if you go to the effort to send it in, we'll shoot it off to you. All right, folks, almost as we hit 30 minutes, we've got to sign off somewhere around the world today. But this is the bit where Ben scrambles and finds his piece of paper.
I've got it in my hand. We're going Dutch.
Okay, so here we go. Folks,
God, who knows what that is.
Until next week.
Tot straks. Tot straks. Tot straks.
Oh, that's actually pretty good.
There we go.
There you go, folks. Tot straks.
God, I just laughed.
We'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in.